Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast, a podcast about stage musicals that have been legally filmed and publicly distributed. The Filmed Live Musicals website contains information on nearly 200 musicals that have been captured live. Check it out at filmedlivemusicals.com. And now, on with the show. Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast. I'm your host, Luisa Lyons, and my guest today is the multi-award winning Australian conductor, musical director, composer, and arranger, Kevin Purcell, whose work spans across the worlds of opera, classical, and musical theatre. His most recent work is the virtual musical Castle Gillian, an Irish Tale, a full-scale virtual reality musical. Castle Gillian is an official selection of the Festival of International Virtual and Augmented Reality Stories and was recently screened at the Cannes World Film Festival, where it was nominated for Best Soundtrack and won Best 360-degree Film and Best Musical Film. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, Louisa. How are you?
I'm great. I'm super excited to be chatting with a fellow Aussie.
Yeah, it's nice. It's when in New York, it's the most noticeable accent when you hear people on the street and you go, Australian. Yep.
I always stop people. People think I'm weird, especially when I'm at the theatre. I'll be like, "Oh, Aussie."
Exactly. Yeah.
We've got a band together.
Yeah, no, I try not.
There are a lot of us in New York.
I try not to do it, but every now and again, you just can't help it because you pick it out, and some of the conversations you hear are really funny. But particularly when they're first time tourists into New York. But you sort of go, no, we're not going to do that.
Oh, I love doing it because we know how far they've come.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a long way from anywhere to anywhere from Australia. Yeah. I've got Greek guys painting the house here outside right now. They've been here for 4 weeks. And the thing they said to me this morning was, it's a really long way to anywhere from here. And I went, yep, absolutely.
When I was in Spain, the most common phrase that I heard when people found out where I was from, "Ay, que lejos." They couldn't believe how far away that we were from.
Exactly. It is. It's a long way.
So, to start us off with, what made you fall in love with musical theatre?
My grandmother was a concert pianist, and she was also a Dame of the British Empire. Her name was Dame Mary Daly. So it's an honorific that belongs to the British Empire, as it were. So it's the equivalent of Sir. And but she spent a lot of time working during the war effort, for which she received the DBE. But then she also worked for an organisation here and looking after disabled children called the Urala Society for in the post-war period. And she also wrote children's books as well, which each of her grandchildren star in one of those books. So anyway, she... So along with that, she was also a concert pianist, and she had every musical theatre score from operettas right through to sort of Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern. And so she used to sit me at the piano, much against my will, I have to say. I was 7 or 8 or something like that, and she would literally sort of teach me the piano, and then she would make me play the melody line of something from Showboat or whatever, and then she would play the accompaniment, and so I got a life's lesson in musical theatre, when I didn't even know what musical theatre was. And, I wasn't particularly interested in it, at that time, as well, because I wanted to be outside, playing football. But she did me an enormous service, and I loved her very dearly for it, in later years, when, I could play better and then, I could sort of, try to sort of play nearly as well as her. And she got older, and of course we switched over, and she played the melody, and I played the accompaniment, and she was great. She was a great lady. She was very imperious, and it's like, because she was born in 1896, and she came from a different time, and she didn't tolerate fools particularly well, but she did an enormous amount for Australian disabled children in this country. So
Wow.
uh,
And did she spend her life in Australia?
yeah, she did, and she actually lived with us for the last
Mm.
23 years of her life
Oh,
as well. So, which is why I got to, have to sit and play the piano, several times a day sometimes. And she loved playing the piano, but
wow.
she was really interested in having one of her grandchildren, do something sort of on the piano. So I made the mistake of showing some interest in it, and so I was the one who was nominated.
Wow. And at what point did you come to it for yourself when it was beyond sitting at the piano with your grandma?
Um, I think it came about uh, in terms of my active participation in it. It came about after I had won a big international conducting competition in London, and I got picked up by an agent. And the agent said, "Well, I can't get you any work for 2 years with an orchestra because they book 2 years in advance. So I've put you up for an audition with Cameron McIntosh as musical director for Les Miserables." And I went, "What's that?" Um, uh, and um,
Little known musical, understandable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I was immersed sort of like in the orchestral repertoire and learning vast amounts of opera. And
Mm.
so I went and did the audition, and I got the job, which was fine, except they didn't put me on Les Miserables. They sent me over to Cats because for reasons I really don't warrant going into, but um, uh, but then I ended up doing sort of Les Mis and all those things as well. But yeah, so I was that's how I got into it. Yeah.
Mm. Wow. And I know that you studied in Russia and also the Czech Republic, is that right?
Yeah, I studied at the Moscow Conservatory, which was fairly eye opening. And then, as part of the prize of this conducting competition, I also got 2 years of extra study in the Czech Republic. So I was sent to a
Wow.
place called the Janáček Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, which is in a town called Brno, which is spelled Brno, and I've never been able to pronounce it properly. And it's about an hour and a half south of Prague. It's the second largest city in the
Mm.
Czech Republic, but incredible music school. I mean, just uh, you know, um, demanding. I think would be the polite word I could use. I mean, my lessons were like sometimes went 4 to 5 hours, and that was 3 times a week. I mean, I was so tired at the end of a lesson. Um, we get through entire symphonies in 5 hours. Uh, and
Wow.
then you'd have a day to learn the next one, and then you'd be back. And it was rigorous,
Yeah.
but of course you learn a lot.
And not just like um, uh, taxing like um, on the brain because there's so many elements that you're thinking about, but physically exhausting too because you're physically active while you're conducting.
Well, we stood because we stood between two pianos, and there was no sort of break every hour. It just went along as long as the conducting professor wanted to go, and but they would sit and play for 4 hours,
Mm.
and. But they weren't tired at all. It was just me who was exhausted, from the mental fatigue of learning which way the hands go up and down, to do all that sort of stuff. So, but it was really fascinating. That part of it was really fascinating because there wasn't also very much food around at that time, and so you had to sort of go to the markets and things and try to find bananas that weren't black on the inside, and um, you know it was a bit of a struggle. So consequently, I was about 20
Mm.
kilos lighter, than I am now, because
Wow.
but it was a privilege. I've always thought it was an absolute privilege to do, even though it was really pretty hard actually in some respects. But the beer was great. in the Czech Republic. So.
I know for singers crossing over from classical to musical theater, not every singer can do it, and it can be challenging. Although it's an amazing base for vocal technique. Often Broadway belters are classically trained. How do you think that transfers as a musical director and as a conductor, like going from the classical world into musical theater?
Yeah, no, they're two different art forms completely. I've
Mm.
never heard I've never heard really anybody successfully um, sort of do both equally as well. I mean, it's possible. I admire people like Renee Fleming for crossing over.
Kelly O'Hara too.
Kelly O'Hara, as well. Um, but I think that the demands of doing musical theatre are so great that it's really not possible to just flip backwards and forwards. And the vocal techniques are completely and utterly different. I mean, things that musical theatre singers do, particularly around drama on the voice, and because they're mic'd up, you couldn't possibly get away with in an opera house.
Mm.
It's just it's not part of the ethos or the aesthetic of the opera world, and it'd be quite dislocating if you started to hear that type of thing. The only person I know who actually ever tried to do it somewhat was Baz Luhrmann when he many years ago now he was trying to put La Boheme on Broadway. Interesting
Huh.
interesting idea, but I think the short answer is the demands are really different, and that requires two different types of techniques. I know one.
How
Yeah.
about as a conductor? Like what changes as a conductor?
Um, I think I don't think it changes anything in the conducting per se. That's my view, because if you're being accompanied by an orchestra, orchestras respond the same way.
Mm.
But there is a need to understand the two different vocal techniques and the mechanisms that are going on, from the whole sort of passage of airflow, across the esophagus, the vocal cords up into the pharyngeal area of the face, and where the sound sort of is pushed from, which of course, when it's done excessively, of course, tends to be pushed out through the nose, through the nasal cavity, and it's not a sound I particularly like. I think it's become a bit of a trope in terms of people copying other, great singers. Kristen Chenoweth, who I love and um, adore, and I've had the opportunity to work with her, so I know this firsthand. I mean, she's Kristen Chenoweth, right? But nobody else is Kristen Chenoweth, and I think the mistake that young singers sometimes make is they don't try to be themselves, and they don't try to develop sort of like the sound that is uniquely theirs. And I think there's a lot of pressure on them, of course, though, to sound like other people. And I think there is not an unreasonable expectation that that's what um, producers and directors might be looking for. So I think they get caught in no man's land sometimes. But you always Kelly O'Hara, since we mentioned her a minute ago. I mean, it's Kelly O'Hara. You can't mistake that. You can't mistake Kristen. You can't mistake Idina. These people. Jesse. These people, they have a unique sound, and I think that's, of course, is what makes them, who they are. It's a good question.
Yeah,
That's a
that's
very good
very,
question.
very interesting. Thank you. And I just want to touch on you worked on Wicked in the West End and then
Yeah.
Cats in the West End and then also in South Korea.
Mm.
What what do you think? What is it like working across international borders on these mega musicals?
I think it's the same. they are very demanding. Um,
Mm.
um, there is lots of money attached to these big 6, 8, 12, million more dollar productions. There's very little room for error. There's
Mm.
very little room for experimentation. It's a product and it has to be delivered the same way 8 times a week. The standard can't drop. It becomes increasingly difficult when you start to work on long-running shows that have been running for many years. When I took over Cats, of course, it had been already running for 17 years. And that brings with it challenges for everybody, not least the orchestral musicians, I have to tell you. But I think the one difference I saw is when we opened, this was the sort of the premiere production of Cats in South Korea. And we did that one in the double tent version, which was also different from me because I'd done it in London as musical director, and that's the only one that's in the round in what was the New London Theatres, now the Gillian Lynn. And the Korean crew didn't quite at the outset understand the demands of the job, and it took them several weeks and a bit of knocking heads together to get them to understand that they couldn't just disappear off for afternoon tea.
Yeah.
But they did. But they were fine, and they did get it together, and they were fantastic to work with.
Yeah. And were you part of the capture that they did at the theater where they filmed it like for TV?
You mean the original version of Cats on?
Yes, the not the recent movie, but the the original made for TV
Yeah, it
version.
was my cast. Well, it was half my cast because half the cast was from predominantly the London production at that time, and then the other half came from New York.
Oh wow!
And that was I don't know exactly the reasons why, but I think it was a case of, well, they were the two premier productions in the world, and they didn't want to feel like one was perhaps being favoured over the other, so they split it down the middle. And so half the New York cast came over, or they were chosen from casts that had done it in New York, and half of them, the other half almost all of them were actually from the London production. They were long days.
And were you? Yeah. So you were rehearsing the cast and helping prepare for the shoot?
Not everybody. I did rehearse a couple of people who were sort of guests, as it were, on that filming. So there was Elaine Page, of course, and I'm just having a mental blank now. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
He was.
I know it's been a little bit between between drinks, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. He's a very Sir John Mills, who played Gus, the theatre cat. He didn't play Growl Tiger because he was too old at that point to do the swashbuckling sequence. But I got to work with those two very eminent actors, and they were. I got an education. I don't think they got much, but I got an education working with them.
Was there anything as you were rehearsing about adjusting for performing on camera versus how you would normally perform it for the theatre?
Yes. Now, the musical supervisor for that filming was very clear that on film the tempi needed to be faster, So
Huh.
it's very interesting that things that are on stage can appear to be quite slow on film. I don't really understand why it is, but um, I think that was the right decision. Um, but it causes problems, of course, in the choreography because Gillian's choreography on that show is so demanding that if you go past what's possible for these very very skilled dancers, what they can actually do, it ended up being a bit of a compromise. But yeah, no. So there is a difference. But I've not done enough film work to really be totally knowledgeable about it in that sense.
And I'm curious just well, I want to come to Castle Gillian and, talk about how it came to be and whatnot, but I'm curious as you were composing it and then recording it, and I guess with your musical director brain too, is there a sense of if you were to perform it live, would you do it at different tempos or would it be different than how you have recorded it for the film?
Almost inevitably, because the issue is that the venue changes. The presentation of what you in the way or the shape and the size of the venue um, really does determine how the only minor adjustments in tempi, but minor adjustments can be quite um, noticeable depending on what the music is. So you try to find like a happy medium about where it really should be, and then it either goes up or down. But like when singers, actors bring something to the work after you've written it, they change the energy on it, and so when you get a bit older and a bit wiser, says he, um, you learn to you learn to not get in the way of what the singer actor brings and let them do what they need to do, and you only sort of have to put a marker in when there are things that really can't vary from what you've written. But in the end, it often
Mm,
comes down to staging issues. That if you do that, we're going to have a problem with something else. And but otherwise, yeah, you you it works it out. I think it just works itself out during the rehearsal process.
yeah.
Everything starts
And
slower.
during development.
Yeah, and everything starts slower and gets faster. And then
Yeah.
after you open and it's been running for a couple of weeks, everything starts to get slower again because it settles down into like the
Yeah.
into the pocket of where it should be, because that sort of first first set of performance energies start to just work themselves out into a flow. And yeah, it's really
Mm,
interesting. You ask good questions,
mm.
Louisa.
Oh, wait, thank you. So let's fast forward to Castle Gillian, and this is your third book adaptation with Victor. Is it Kazan?
Kazan, yeah. Uh,
Kazan, Victor Kazan.
yeah, we did Rebecca back in 2003, 2004, and then we did The Stranger from Seville in 13, 14, and
And were either of those captured
uh,
in any way, like film
mm,
recording or film?
there is a concert performance of Rebecca. It's not
Hmm.
something that I would allow anybody to see. Um, um, uh, it was terribly it was terribly under rehearsed, at the time,
Mm,
like a lot of these things are sometimes.
yeah.
Stranger from Seville was had a little brief run on off Broadway during the 2014 Nymph Festival when it was still alive. Um, so, but of course, you can't record or video those performances because of
Yeah.
the agreements, the union agreements. So that's okay. We got to see it, and it's still sitting on the desk while we work on it in the background, sort of trying to
Yeah.
fix up some of the issues that we identified at that time. And then Castle Gillian, yes, which really started actually in Castle Gillian should have started in 2015, but I didn't have any time to work on it, and so the rights ran out, and so I had to renew the
Oh
rights.
no.
I had to renew the rights with the estate of Maurice Walsh, who very graciously agreed to let me renew them in 2018, and then some of the writing happened in 2018, but then I didn't actually really start to write the show until just before COVID struck.
Mm. And what drew you to this novel? Why Castle Gillian?
Well, I grew up with the novels of Maurice Walsh, and um, so I known them like since I was quite young, and he was, of course, as these things go, he was probably Ireland's most internationally famous novelist during the 1930s and 40s, and then, of course, just dropped off the map, and
Is it The Invisible Man that's his kind of most, they made a movie of it?
no, it's The Quiet Man.
The Quiet Man. I knew
Yeah,
it was a man.
yeah. So the Quiet Man is just a section of a novel um, which John Ford took to make a complete film out of. He changed the story a bit, but it's a it's a it's a it's a charming film. I mean, Martin Scorsese, who is no fool by anybody's measure, um, thinks it's one of the greatest films ever made. And I think that there is some truth in that. I mean, I perhaps always never quite get my head around John Wayne playing an Irishman, but Maureen O'Hara, of course, was Irish, and she's quintessentially sort of the right sort of actress for that role. But I didn't. They actually offered me The Quiet Man, but it had already been done in the early 1960s on Broadway, and it didn't last very long. And they didn't call it The Quiet Man. And it's one of those things on my bucket list to find out why didn't they. I mean, the film had been out for several years and was loved by the American public. Why they didn't call it The Quiet Man on Broadway is like, didn't they have any marketing people in those days?
Yeah, get that name recognition happening for you.
Yeah. So,
what did they call it instead?
Donnybrook, which
Oh,
which is an Irish word for a fist fight,
yeah.
But the fist fight in Castle Gillian, the fist fight in The Quiet Man is really not the story. So anyway, it's just one of those things. So I had to say to them, actually, I'd really like to do Castle Gillian, but I couldn't say to them I actually thought it was a much better story. So the short answer to your question, because I can get sidetracked on this, is it's just one of those quintessentially brilliant Irish narratives, with that sort of laconic Irish humour from the period, but it also has this beautifully arced double love story. And it also deals with a whole lot of issues which I'm quite passionate about, which I generally, of course, don't talk about because nobody ever asked me, and but they are nonetheless true. And one of them is, of course, the two big issues in Castle Gillian. It's not the double love story. It's the fact that there are three issues. The first one is that it deals with a wartime soldier who returns back to Ireland, and he's suffering from terrible post-traumatic stress disorder, but of course they didn't call it that during the 1940s. But the same reactions occur. People don't understand why the person's changed. The person themselves is not coping very well with understanding why they've changed. And I saw this firsthand with my brother, who was in the first Afghanistan war, and then went back and did another stint. And post-traumatic stress disorder is just the most awful thing to watch in somebody. And so for all the returned veterans, I did the musical for them. Makes me quite emotional, I'm sorry.
No, that's
The second one is the way that Irish or Indigenous communities are treated. So in Ireland, it's the Irish Travellers, and you know there's a long history of um, um, you know being treated very badly in Ireland. That's the second issue, and of course the third one which is the two women characters in Castle Gillian are not anybody's wallflowers. The characters of Sylvia and Mary are pretty feisty, and they're the ones who end up holding the show together. So the story of Castle Gillian is really about Gil. Although there are two Gillians in Castle Gillian, old man Gillian and young Gillian, who's called Gil. And it's really his story, but the driving force behind his story are these two women. And I just think it's one of the great stories ever written. And I don't care that people think that it's perhaps a little old-fashioned in its narrative. It's just a great story, and it's got this wicked
and
ending.
when people hear your gorgeous score, and especially I predict that once people hear it, Go Anywhere will be like in every audition room.
Yeah,
Sylvia's song
yeah.
will be that's going to be the next big song that everybody uses.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a fun song. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I didn't write it. I actually didn't write it to be sort of this thing that everybody latches onto. It's one of the, like composers never see. I mean, I can tell you there are songs that I like probably more in the show, but they're the composer's likes, as opposed to the things that sort of have this immediacy about them, But yeah, look, it tickles me no end that song is actually sung at a racetrack. After after she's just had some very bad news from Gil, which she doesn't see coming, and she spent most of the show being quite manipulative with Gil, trying to sort of sort out all these problems, and then he drops a bit of a bombshell, and then she sort of drops into this number, which she's left alone and, at the top of a grandstand, a public grandstand at the racetrack, so, she doesn't sort of, there's no sort of bringing it down into a spotlight, sort of, in a room of, it's it's actually at the racetrack.
Yeah, no, it's fab. And the whole score is so beautiful. It's I saw on your website that there's a cast recording coming soon. Is that happening?
There is, but sometimes I get so time poor that I have it on my list of things to do. Of going, I mean, I can tell you, and I don't know whether this will be the case, but I would really like Ghostlight to put it out, or Warner, But I need to speak to Kurt Deutsch, and I just can't find the time to set up the meeting to sort of go, can you put out my soundtrack? But I really do need to get to it. So
yes, please. Your fans demand it, please.
yeah, I mean, look, I'm not overly worried about it because you are right. It is. I'm not going to talk about whether it's good or bad, but it's beautifully recorded.
It's good, and I saw that you played guitar and mandolin and did the synthesizer programming, and I was actually shocked by the kind of how few musicians are listed in the film, because it sounds like a full orchestra. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, well, it's a brave new world, Louisa, and we now these days we have a couple of remarkable tools, but there are. I'm going to put a plug in here for an English company called Spitfire. So they have these the Spitfire libraries. Any musician watching this is going to know. They have the most remarkable sample libraries available now. So, but the downside of it is that it takes longer to do this way than it does for me to get into a room with an orchestra. It takes about 5 times as long because the orchestra will knock it over in about that show you could record in probably about 10 hours. But it takes many hours to do it, sort of using computers and things. But there were certainly some instruments that we just simply weren't ever going to do, using sort of the electronics, and that obviously was the boron, the Irish drum, which there's a fantastic boron player here in Melbourne, Beck Simpson, and then I had members of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra come in and play some things, which just had to be done, and then of course I got to sort of play guitar on a fair amount of it actually, because there's about three or four guitar things and bits of mandolin and one very bad piece of banjo playing because I don't know how to play the banjo. But somebody actually asked me not long ago. They were talking about that song that you were talking about a minute ago. I'm going, well, I remember that song not because I'm writing it, but because the guitar solo in that took me 71 takes to get one that was right.
Oh my god!
And this is the thing that nobody ever talks about. It's they go, oh yeah, I just played it the first time. But the guitar solo in it is so difficult that I actually I messed it up 70 times.
You should have had a word with the composer.
I was like, who wrote this? My fingers were shredded, but look, it worked out okay. So of course now everybody goes, "Where's this guitar solo?" It's like, well, why isn't it turned up louder? I'm going, well, because it's not about the guitar solo; it's about the woman singing.
70 takes.
Yeah.
So when this show does get produced, the future guitarist can knock on your door.
I've got to tell you that if I was in the pit conducting it, which I hope that I never do, because I don't think composers should ever stand in the pit of their own shows. But I'm going to lean over into the pit and actually tell the guitar player to turn it up, and tell them and good luck.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you started writing this during COVID. Is your I'm blanking on his name. We just said it out loud. Your co-writer,
yeah, Victor.
Yeah. Thank you. Is he in London or in Australia?
No, Victor's lived in Australia for many years. He's a very famous British playwright and British director, stage director. Not that he ever talks about it, but even to this day, every now and again, he comes out with a story of working with somebody, and I go, "I'm sorry, who?" And it's like somebody is sort of like incredibly famous, and they're he's very good at what he does. So, and unfortunately,
so he was in Melbourne with you.
Yeah, no, he was. We've although we don't often work in the same room at the same time. And in that show, it was also slightly different. Than a lot of the time, I wrote some of the tunes first, and then Victor wrote lyrics for it afterwards. So, although we knew what the song was going to be about, but and I think I'm not sure if this is true, but I was going to say most songwriters, I think, prefer to work from somebody giving them a lyric first. I know Andrew doesn't. I know Andrew sort of always writes his tunes first, but I think it's easier for songwriters to have a lyric. And I don't write lyrics. at the best of times. So it was an interesting excursion doing that. A lot of the music actually came first in that show. So not always the case, but it was in that one
Interesting.
there.
And obviously, it's a virtual reality musical. So, why did you choose to do this musical in VR?
Look, I'll tell you the honest truth, right? I just thought it was a really cool idea. It's like suddenly, now that there's sort of a periphery of people who are starting to become aware of it, and people can't really become aware of it, unless I actually get to talk to Kurt and he agrees to put the soundtrack out so they can learn some of the music. But um, I'm holding it back. So there's no public release of Castle Gillian because I want to offer it to American theatres, and I don't want it. I'm not going to offer it to the general public. I want the theatres to be able to offer it, so that they can get some benefit from it. Because we haven't talked about it, but of course, the way that we've done it allows them to do it really easily. But the answer to your question is, it came down as like, I just think this would be fun, and I sort of figured that I knew how to do it. Um, Turns out that nothing could have been further from the truth. And
Oh, that looks easy.
yeah, it's not. It's really not that easy.
Yeah.
And it took
So, what is the process? So, you write the show, and then what happens next?
the first thing that you then do is record it. And that means recording every line of dialogue, um, uh, every moment of music, the whole lot. And then you go into a rehearsal room for 2 or 3 weeks, and you block out the staging as you would in a rehearsal room. And then you video record that blocking and that staging. And then you go into another studio and you motion capture every one of those actors in their motion capture suits. Um, and they're all terrible on the first day. I mean, they can't even get their legs into the suits, but by about the third day, they're so expert at it. And they can wire themselves up, and they know where the sensors go, and when the sensors are not in position. And then you do 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, 12 hours a day of motion capturing the whole show. And then you build, I don't want to know what it is. Is it 17? You build 17 different locations in a game engine in 360 degrees. And then you put into those in worlds, you put your actors now who've been turned into avatars into that world, and you make it all happen. And of course, for that means that you've got to work out the same. You've got to have your choreography done so that you can motion capture the choreography for the dance sequences. And then you've also got to have a costume designer who's did 37 costumes. And every one of those costumes, of course, is a different version of the avatar. You can't just put clothes on and off people in a game engine, and then you have to light it like you would a stage show, and so forth and so forth. So it's like doing a stage show, but doing it completely backwards.
So, what are the benefits to doing it? Why not just like do a workshop and then stage it and film the stage version? What are the benefits of doing it this way?
I'm not sure that there are any benefits as opposed to producing a live show.
I mean, I would say scenery for one. Like the locations that you have are like they're stunning in the VR capture. Like you couldn't do that in a quick, staged reading or a workshop production. That you have these
no, no,
epic
no, 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 no. I mean,
locations and backgrounds.
no, they took 18 months to build. Um, uh, but what you can do is you can use them as back projections in a live
Mm,
presentation of the show.
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
uh, because of the fact that they are in 360 degrees, so you can actually also track them as actors move. The scenery can actually track us within a back projection. Um, look, we get into the nitty gritty of something that would make this podcast run 2 hours or 3 hours. So the issue is at the end of the day that I sort of did it because I wanted to see whether it could be done. And not everybody. I was going to say there are a few people who said to me, "Oh, you can't do that. Like that's not possible." And I went, "Really?
All the more reason to do it.
That's really not a good thing to say to me at the best of times." So,
Yeah.
so, but I mean, I have to, I've been in this business for a long time, and I think there is a necessity for the theatre industry to come to grips with the fact that third screen technologies and the way that the world is consuming its entertainment is shifting, um, and uh, and I think there needs to be a recognition of, well, what can the technology do for us that will encourage people to come to the theatre. I mean, that's really at the end of the day, if I'm being deadly serious about it, this is what it's
Yeah.
about. And
Mm.
but see, as soon as you do it, I've had one or two people tell me that, well, what you've done is you've put every actor out of work, and I've had to sort of,
You've employed like 20 people.
all paid at scale, you know, um, but like it took real actors to make the performances that we actually were able to elicit from them, keeping in mind that their bodies were motion captured, their faces were separately motion captured, right? Because obviously you've got to have mouths moving in sync when they're singing, and it never looks right when it happens automatically. You've got to actually have expression on the face. And I'm going, no, none of this is what it's about. It's about just saying, okay, well, I'll do something, and maybe people will start to think about, well, what else could we do? You know, what else?
Mm.
Which other ways could we use the technologies to sort of, bring a marriage of the way the world is moving. I defy anybody to tell me that's not true. Into this magic which is live theatre, and the viscerality of live theatre can't ever be supplanted. I mean, you can't replicate it on screen. I mean, we capture the sort of on screen like any film. We're telling you where to look. We're telling you what to feel, right? But when you go to the theatre, nobody tells you what to feel. You know, nobody tells you where to look. I mean, we use lighting and stage blocking to shape performances, in terms of a director's perception, distilling the story through the director's lens. But what you do in the theatre as an individual is entirely up to you. You know, my wife hates me because in the theatre, she's looking at the stage and I'm looking up around behind me, looking at, sort of
Look at the
like
conductor cam.
looking at the conductor cam, or looking at how the lighting's, where the lighting grid is, to see how they've pulled off some effect. So, I mean, there's just it's not meant to be replacing anything. It's just meant to be going, look, it is doable. It's possible, and if you do it with the amount of care that we took, um, you end up with something that we think works pretty well. but it
and is visually stunning. It's absolutely this again, the scenery is just so the detail in it is so beautiful, and it's like not surprising that it took 18 months to construct.
that part of it, yeah. I mean, it took over 3 years to put the 126 minutes of it together. I mean,
Mm.
in the 5 Hours Festival that you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction, I mean, one of the comments on their Discord channel was somebody wrote, "I'm flabbergasted that there's a complete musical because like a lot of virtual reality things are maybe 10 minutes long, 15 minutes long, but Castle Gillian is a full 2 act musical which runs 126 minutes, 127 minutes if you
Mm.
run with the credits, but the actual show runs
Yeah.
126 minutes. um, um, yeah, and if you actually get to see it in a virtual reality headset, it really is something, particularly
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
no, I was about to say, and use really good headphones. Yeah, but that's the composer in me sort of going, listen to the audio. It's really good. Um,
So you talked about watching in a headset. What I love about how you've set it up is that someone like me who doesn't have a headset, I'm dying to get one, can still enjoy it. And there's a way to still explore the world just on a desktop. You can still do the 360, and then there's the option to view it like the movie version. They're just watching without interacting.
yes, but there's also, if you've got an iPad or a smartphone, you can also actually just you pick up your phone or your iPad and you can move it around, and it moves it for you. You don't actually have to try to sort of manipulate the screen
Mm,
on a
yeah.
smart device. If you're watching it on a desktop computer, you use a trackpad or a mouse to move yourself around through the 360 degrees. And then there's also simple recognition that there are some people um, who, for reasons that suit them, it could be that they're not comfortable with the technology, but it might also just be that they don't have enough mobility. Um,
Yeah.
Something is an issue really important to me. This was through my grandmother. That we also did a cinematic style cut where we actually did all the camera, we did everything for you, so you can just sit and watch it like you're watching a normal film. And
Yeah.
that's just to allow pretty much anybody anywhere, as long as they've got an internet connection, to be able to see it. So you're quite right, you don't need the VR headset. You can watch it. It's really cool in the headset, but it is also really cool just with a smart device. I use my iPad, and I sit in a swivel chair and I swivel myself around, and
Oh, okay. Now I need to watch it on my iPad. I watched the cinematic version, so now I need to do it on my iPad.
it's fun doing it that way because I built into it, as along, Victor and I, we built into it certain things that are happening behind you,
Oh,
which you don't actually, unless if you don't see it, it won't matter. But because
yeah.
you're
But
focused on
they're
looking at the
Easter
action, but
eggs.
there are Easter eggs going on sort of in all sorts of different places. Um, uh, and there are funny gags as well. For example, at the racetrack, one of the bookies' names is Purcell, right on the board, right, and that's because my father was a bookie, right,
Oh, no way.
and my wife's mother owned racehorses, and so all her racehorses
Mm.
are on the betting board as well. And so all sorts of things that people don't need to know, but there are
Yeah,
all these sort of like Easter eggs, and there are a few in gags, um, you know, um, uh, that get placed throughout it. Um,
yeah.
it's fun, and of course, if you the other part of it, I should say too, is that if you switch from looking at one version of the other, for example, if you had a VR headset on and you took your VR headset off and you picked up your phone, it remembers where you were.
Mm,
So you don't have to start over again. It just tracks. It has the time stamping, so it knows where you are. Um,
yeah,
um,
that's extraordinary.
Thank you to
And
my
you
web
mentioned
guys. Yep.
You mentioned that you're not going to do a general release, but you want to release it to theaters. Can you explain what that looks like?
Uh, yeah, I do. I'm working on a presentation or pitch package to um, any theatre company in the US that actually has their own website. And what will happen is that, um, without getting too technical about this, we can sort of copy or clone the website any number of times, and we can make it look like it's coming from the theatre itself, but in fact it's not.
Mm.
And so they don't have to do any technical implementation whatsoever. We do all the financial ticketing, the ticketing and the finances, and all the reconciliation for them as well. And they get, most of the ticket price. There's some administration costs that we have, and then we treat our payments as royalties, as like in any
Mm.
theatre production. But the beautiful part of it really is when I was explaining it to a theatre company in New York not so long ago, all you have to provide me is your theatre logo. But if you don't want to do that, I can just take it from your website anyway. But all you need to do is provide me with your theatre logo, the name of your theatre, which we know anyway, and your key personnel. Your managing director, your artistic director. Um, that's all you have to do, and it's going to look like it's
Mm.
coming from, you know, um, I won't. I'm not going to name any theatre, but whatever. Pick your own theatre.
XYZ
Yeah,
theater, yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's an offering that's coming from your theatre. But
Mm.
there's
And what this is a really cool model. Like you're creating a model of a way for companies to create work and then rent it out to you're doing a tour without the expense of doing a tour.
it's like taking a buy-in production, but there's no buy-in cost.
Yeah.
I think that not unreasonably, I have to say that a lot of really in industrious and hardworking theatres in the US during the main part of the COVID pandemic tried very hard to do digital theatre offerings. And of course, what they found, not unsurprisingly, was that it's really hard work. The technical stuff behind doing things that are internet based is not for the faint hearted. And
Mm.
once the restrictions of the pandemic subsided a little, um, their natural inclination, of course, is to divest themselves of doing the digital work and going back to trying to bring people back into their theatres. Now, that's the right decision. Um, but my concern is that there is now what potentially happens is that they realise that doing digital theatre is not that easy. Um, um, and so they'll let that go. But there is a whole um, uh, group of potential theatre people who will come to the theatre through third screen offerings. But you've got to have the offerings to be able to entice them. But even more importantly than that, it's got to work. It's got to work 100% of the time. It's got to be like no technical obstacles in the path of the theatre. And unless you can do that, the theatres reasonably are going to go, love to, but we don't either have the
Too
personnel,
hard.
we don't have the time when we're
Mm.
committed to X number of stage productions. And it's just a resource that's like a bridge too far. So what I've tried to
Yeah.
do is take away all those problems for them.
Mm.
Uh, and, you know, given any luck, they'll sort of go, sure, we'll offer it to our subscribers or our members or our
Subscribers.
patrons, and I'm not going to insist that they buy X number of tickets because they won't know. they won't know how many of their patrons will want to take it up.
No.
So just go, well, you know,
Yeah.
we'll just manage whatever you sort of want to, whatever you can do. But of course, the more tickets they
Yeah.
do sell, the more income they're receiving, right? So
Yeah.
so hopefully, they will do a lot of it, and then of course that comes into the fact that we've got at least 3 different ways that you can actually watch it. So, you don't have to be concerned if you don't have a VR headset.
Yeah. It makes it more accessible.
Mm.
And then last question before I have one more section. But um, do you envision a full in-person production of Castle Gillian?
I'd love to see a full scale production of it. I mean, um, it's very hard to ask the creatives about sort of uh, should people do it? Of course, you should do it. Um, um, but that's never been left in the hands of creators. Really, that's always other people who decide whether they think that they can make it work on stage. For them. I certainly don't want people
Is
being
it
put off
something that you?
by the sheer
Yeah.
scale of this digital extravaganza.
Well, like you said, you have the inbuilt, you have the digital backdrops ready to go if people want to use those. That's very common now to sell a license
Yeah.
with projections included. Um, but is it something that you're looking to license?
Uh,
Like, could Castle Gillian be licensed now? And kind of when you sell it as a virtual package, like the license could come with it, and a theater could feasibly
mm.
like screen it this season and then next season do it in person.
Yeah, I think so. Uh, I, I mean, that would be great. I mean, we like all the we're now talking to theatre people, of course. The that there are issues around options and stuff. So you don't usually go to, I mean, look, I have no idea what I'm talking about, Louisa. So the short answer is, as far as I'm concerned, if somebody'd like to do it, I'm sure that we can probably find a way for them to be
Can
able to.
figure it
Yeah,
out.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, well, this is just I've truly I just loved being able to experience this show, and thank you so much for sharing it with me. It's
Pleasure.
just it's so beautiful, and I hope it takes off. This brings us to my final segment called My Favorite Things, where I ask you my favorite
Mm.
questions. And first up is, what is your favorite musical?
Um, God, there are going to be so many people who hate me. Um, um, okay, for reasons that make no sense whatsoever, the one that really, really affects me is a show called Marguerite by Michel Legrand.
Oh, interesting.
Um, uh,
What is it? It just tugs
it's
it,
really a
just
take.
grabs at your throat.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I find the music of Michel Legrand to be quite extraordinary, and it wasn't terribly successful in London's West End. I saw it many times. I would kill to musically direct that show. Um, 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 but so that's my answer, because otherwise I'm going to get into qualifying my remarks. But I love Marguerite.
You have to pitch it to neglected musicals and see if they'll let you do it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a great show. Like a lot of these shows, they start to tinker with them because they weren't successful, and sometimes I think it's a bit like, don't tinker with it. It'll
Yeah,
have its own time, But anyway,
yeah.
that's my answer. I'm going with Marguerite, Michel Legrand.
I Great, great answer. Do you have a favorite musical that has been filmed live on stage?
Um, that's been filmed live on stage. I'm going to go with Prince of Egypt.
Ooh, you've seen it?
Yeah.
Have you seen the film or
Yep,
the stage show?
I've seen the film.
Oh, it's coming out very soon. I'm very excited. And I interviewed the director not long ago, and another Aussie, and he was so excited about that capture particularly. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, Schwartz is a genius. Um,
yeah,
um, you know, what else can you say? Um,
yeah.
I, you know, yeah, that's why I'm going with that one. Yep.
Ooh, that makes me so excited because that will be coming out soon. A filmed live musical is not exactly a stage show, and it's not exactly a film. So what should we call it?
Um, Cinematic musicals.
Ooh, that's an interesting one. Where do you stand on bootlegs?
Um, I think I'd like to put them all in the desert without any water.
That's that's very descriptive. I like that. Which stage musicals do you wish had been filmed live on stage?
Uh, hmm, the frogs.
Ah, I'm performing in that in just under a month. I'm very excited.
Yeah, I wish that had been done. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
but there's any
Speaking of bootlegs, there is one.
is there? Yeah, like
Yeah,
I look,
it's terrible.
I don't like bootlegs because that means that nobody who should have earned an income from it earned an income from it. It's hard
Yeah.
enough, so it's a bit like don't ask me any questions about whether Spotify should exist in this world. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's another time, another question, another
I what would you like to see filmed in the future?
time. Okay, so there's this great musical coming called To Catch a Thief, with lyrics and book by Peter Sham, who wrote Lend Me a
Mm-hmm.
Tenor. I'd like to see that filmed. I won't mention the fact
Ooh.
that I'm the composer for it, but
Well, we'll have you back on once it's filmed.
great.
When is that opening regionally or on Broadway or not sure yet?
I don't have no idea. The last I heard was maybe it might open in Portsmouth in the UK.
Oh
But
wow.
you know, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's like it's just a mythology until something happens. Yeah,
Yeah, until you see the contract, it's not
that's right.
happening.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
And finally, where can we find you online?
I have a very strange online presence, of course, because um, uh, I, I have, what's the word? I jump between two worlds. So I jump between sort of the orchestral world and I jump between the musical theatre world. And I've never adequately worked out how to actually do that very well. So there is a website for kevinpurcell.com.au, but it's really only got to do with my conducting work. Um, and there is another website called kazanandpurcell.com, and that gives a bit of a breakdown of some of Victor's and my work. Um, but hopefully not too far away, there'll actually also be a To Catch a Thief musical.com website up and running as well. So hopefully we'll get to sort of share some stuff on that about that then. Yeah. God, there's so many
Wonderful.
hours.
And hopefully
So many
when
hours in the day I don't have. Yep.
yeah, when Castle Gillian gets picked up, hopefully we can share where listeners and viewers will be able to stream it.
Yes. Well, that will come through. It'll be castlegillian.com / the name of the theatre.
Great.
That's how that will work. But there is a partially live website of Castle Gillian available now at castlegillian.com, but it's quite sparse for reasons that it's not being publicly disseminated right now. So you can't watch the film from castlegillian.com, but I think you can watch the trailer if I remember correctly. And the trailer's fun. You get a quick idea in 90 seconds what's going on. So.
And folks can sign up for the Filmed Live Musicals newsletter, and we'll be, of course, sharing when it becomes available and where you can buy tickets, and also in the Filmed Live Musical streaming calendar. Kevin, thank you again so much for your time. This has been so much fun, and
Thanks,
I've loved learning more about the show and more about you too.
Thanks, Louisa. Really good to speak to you, and I'll be seeing you quite shortly.
The Filmed Live Musicals podcast is created and edited by your host, Luisa Lyons. FilmedLiveMusicals.com features information on nearly 200 filmed stage musicals from around the world and dating back to 1938, a weekly newsletter with upcoming streams, and this very podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and make sure to sign up for the weekly newsletter to have upcoming streams delivered straight to your inbox. Filmed Live Musicals is financially supported by Josh Brandon, Geraldine Brewer, Belinda Broido, Andy Capone, Elliot Charles, Rachel Esteban, Mercedes Esteban Lyons, Hannah Graneman, James T. Lane, Jim McCarthy, Allison Matthews, Al Monaco, David Negrin, Jesse Rabinowitz and Brenda Goodman, David and Catherine Rabinowitz, Joe Tillotson, and Beck Twist. If you would also like to support the preservation of the history of film stage musicals and the creation of one easy place to find them all, you can now make a tax-deductible donation to Filmed Live Musicals via The Field. Visit filmedlivemusicals.com to learn more. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and thanks for listening.